Hello all, welcome to JavaScript Interview Series. In this video, we are going to discuss about what is var, let and const, what are the difference between them, and the most important point, which keyword we should use when we are declaring a variable. So let's start. So let's understand few jargons which we commonly use in technical world. So one is declaration. It means that creation of a variable, and initialization means assigning a value to that variable. Let's take one example. If I want to create a variable using var, I'll just write var. The name of the variable, let's write it here as x. So till now, we have just declared a variable here. Instead of saying I created a variable, I can say here I declared a variable. And when I assign this value to the variable, I'll say that I initialized value 10 to this variable. So I hope you understand these two terminologies now. Let's create more two variables using let and also const. So let's write let y and the value 20. In the same way, I'll just create one more variable using const and name it as z and the value 30. So to print this variable values, I'll use function console.log, and inside that I'll write name of the variables x, y and z, save it the file, and let's run this file node index.js. Now you can see that it's printing the values 10, 20 and 30. This is how we declare a variable and also initialize a value inside JavaScript. So before moving forward to the next topic, let's understand few important points. So when JavaScript was created, there was only one way to create a variable or declare a variable, which is var keyword. But later on, when developers started using var keyword, they identified a lot of issues with var. So to resolve those issues which were there in var, in 2015, in ECMAScript 6, let and const were introduced. So that is why now we have total 3 ways to create or declare variables. But earlier when JavaScript was created, at the time we had only one way to create variables, which is using var. Let's talk about scopes now. So when JavaScript was created, right, at the time we had only one way to create variable using var, right? So at that time we had only two types of scopes. One is global scope and other one is function scope. But when let and const were introduced, at that time only one more new type of scope was introduced, which is block scope. So let's understand what the scopes are. And before that, there is one more important point. So as I already told that when var was introduced during the JavaScript was created, at the time we had only two types of scope, right? So that is why var has function scope and let and const have block scope. We are going to understand what this statement means and what block scope and function scope is one by one. So before that, let's understand what global scope is. So global scope is nothing but when I declared any variables, right, not inside any block or inside a function, and those variables can be accessible anywhere inside the JavaScript file, it means that those variables have global scope. Like right now here, I have declared these three variables and I haven't declared this inside any block or function. So that is why these variables can be accessible inside the whole file. I can also access these variables inside any block or inside any function or anywhere inside the file. So that is why we can say that these variables have block scope. Now let's understand what function scope is. So function scope means the variables created inside the function, and those functions can only be accessed inside the function, not outside, if those variables have function scope. So let's understand by creating one function, and let's give it this function name as myFun, and let's create one variable using var. So var, let's give it the name of the variable as name and the value John. If I try to access this variable inside the function, and let me call this function also. So if this name is accessible only inside this function within this parenthesis, then we can say that this variable has function scope. But when I able to access this variable even outside of the function, if this is possible, then we can say that this variable does not have function scope. If it is restricted inside this curly braces, then only we can say that this variable has function scope. So let's see if this is accessible or not. So I'll just write node index.js. So now we can see that it's printing John, means this variable is accessible within this curly braces. Let's also see if it is accessible outside of the function. Let's see. Again, I'll run this file and I see that it's throwing a reference error that name is not defined. So this name is not accessible outside of the function. So that is why I told that var has function scope. Let's see if var has a block scope or not. So for that, let me comment this line of codes and let's see. So before that, let's understand what block is. So block is nothing but curly braces, and whatever we write inside that, it will represent as block. Even this single curly braces also represent one block. And why we use these blocks? I'll take one example. We have if condition, right? And if I want to print one statement, I'll write here hello. And if I try to run this file, it's printing hello. So because we have one line of statement here, either I can write inside this curly braces or I can also exclude this. We can skip this and still it's going to run. But what in case of we have multiple line of code to execute? So if I want to print multiple line of code, in that case, I have to write this curly braces and inside that I have to write all the line of codes. And I want to execute as a single unit all this line of codes. So for that, we'll just wrap all this code inside this curly braces, and here this curly braces represent here block. So if I try to run here, it's printing hello world as a single unit. Block is nothing but multiple line of code wrapped around the curly braces. Even this empty curly braces represent block. So let's see if var has block scope or not. So inside this block, let me give it as here if condition and I'll write it as true, so it will always run. And I'll create one more variable here, var. Again, let's give it the name as a variable name and I'll just write value John. And if I try to access this name outside of the block, if it's accessible outside of the block, it means this variable does not have block scope. So let's run and see if it is accessible or not. It is accessible. So that is why we say that var does not have block scope. It has only function scope. Let's check if let and const have block scope or not. So if I do the same thing with let and if I try to run, it's throwing an error that name is not defined. So this issue which was there in var, that var only had global scope, that issue was resolved using let. Even with const also, I can access it and see if it is accessible or not. So even the const is also going to throw another the same error that name is not defined. So this was one issue, that let and const has block scope and var only has function scope. And this variable which is created, it has block scope, means it can be only accessible inside this curly braces, inside this block only. So that is why let and const have block scope. Let's understand few more issues related to var. The second issue was related to hoisting. So for example, I'll first console.log, I'll write here name, and after accessing, I'll create a variable and initialize a value. So for example, I'll write here var, then name equals to John. If we were not in JavaScript and we are using any other programming language, in that case, it is used to throw an error. But in JavaScript, it's printing undefined. And why it's printing undefined? So for that, we have one concept called hoisting. So in this video, I'm not going to explain what hoisting is. For that, I'll create a separate video. Maybe the next video will be on the topic of hoisting only. Kindly watch that video also. But here, just remember that this is happening because of hoisting. So because of this issue was there inside this JavaScript with var keyword, even this issue was resolved inside let and const. So if I try to access it, it's throwing an error that cannot access name before initialization. In the same case, when I do with const, again inside const also, it's going to throw an error. Yes, it is throwing an error that name before initialization cannot be accessed. So even this issue was resolved. Let's discuss one more issue, which is related to redeclaration. So for example, I'll just created one more variable, again name, and I'll just write value as John. After few lines of code, if I just redeclare the same variable with same name, and I'll write here from John to Johnny. And if I console log name, and if I try to run this, it's printing Johnny. Means this name variable is overriding the above variable name. And this was the issue, that for example, I have written a business logic and accidentally I created one more variable with the same name. So it's going to override the above variable value. And this was the issue. To resolve this, again, let and const were introduced and it resolved the issue of even redeclaration also. So if I just change var to let, and again if I try to do the same thing, and if I write here Johnny, and let's try to rerun, it's throwing an error that identifier is here let, const and var. So all these three are identifiers here. So identifier name has already been declared. So it's throwing an error that it is already declared, so we cannot do that. But this was not in the case of var. And let's also try with const. And let's run. Before that, let me clear the terminal. It's throwing an error that name has already been declared. So now you understood what let, where, const are, what are block scope, function scope, and you have also understood what are the issues we had with where, and those were resolved in let and const. Now you may be having a question that both let and const are resolving the same issues which were there in where, then why we have two different keywords, let and const? What are the difference between let and const? So let's understand that point. So for example, we use let when we have variable with changeable values. For example, I create a variable name as name, and I'll by default and initialize with value John. And after that, I want to change the value from John to Johnny. And if I console log name, it's going to print Johnny. So here we'll use let only if the variable values are changeable, like from John to Johnny. But we cannot do the same thing in case of const. It's throwing an error that assignment to the constant variable, it's throwing type error. So this is not possible. So whatever variables values are not changeable, so it is fixed now John. We cannot change the value. So in that case, we use const. If the values are changeable, then we use let. And there is one more difference in let and const. That is, in const, we cannot just declare a variable and not initialize any value. So if I just run this file, it's going to throw an error that missing initializer in const declaration. So in const, we cannot just declare a variable and not initialize any value. So this is mandatory in case of const that you have to initialize a value, but this is not mandatory in case of let. So if I just write let, I just declared, and let's run. So it is running. It is not printing because I am not console logging that, but its file is working properly. So this was the case. So let's conclude this. Yeah, before concluding, let's understand which keyword we should use. So out of these three keywords, give priority to the const variable when the values are not reassignable. If the values are reassignable, use let, but never use var. So let's conclude this video. So what we have discussed till now, that var, let and const are used declaring a variable in JavaScript. Var is function scope and let, const have block scope. Var can be redeclared, but let and const not. When declaring variable using const, it is mandatory to initialize with value. Var variables are hoisted, while let const variables have temporal dead zone. So what this line means, we are going to discuss this in next video, where I will be explaining what hoisting means, what temporal dead zone means, and why when I try to access the variable which is not declared, in that case why it is printing undefined. Most important point, going to discuss that how JavaScript execute our JavaScript code. So thank you, and please do subscribe and like the video.